Great pleasure to be here with you again for our second webinar, where we will all be together for the first hour, and then the second part of this webinar focuses very much on the role of principals in leading the reform. Welcome from Jane, Chris and myself, and we're looking forward to working with you this morning. And what we'd like to do, first of all, is look at the programme for the webinar. So we're going to be looking at the OECD report, which we asked you to look at the end of last webinar, last Wednesday. And we're going to have some discussion about that. And then we will go through the international examples of curriculum reform, which will be Croatia, Wales and Scotland. Then we'll have a short break for 15 minutes. And then for the second part of this webinar, we will focus very much on the role of the principal and the role of their leadership within this curriculum reform. We'll have a break of about 30 minutes, roughly 12:30. You may be able to get yourself something to eat, but hopefully a drink. And then we'll move on to looking at curriculum mapping and making an action plan, and then finalise with next steps, things that you might take away and want to do back in your schools. So basically, you're very, very welcome to continue with the second part of the webinar, but it will be very much focused on the work of principals. Now, I think there was a little bit of confusion last time about how we're organising the webinars 2, 3, 4 and 5. So we just wanted to absolutely clarify with you what Chris, Jane and I felt was most appropriate, because you are different groups. You are principals, you are teachers, you're people from municipalities, you're people that have written and compiled the competencies, that we felt it would be appropriate that for there to be a webinar that focused very much on your role, because your roles are quite different, although you will share some of the activities, and although you will be working together, it's very much a team effort. You do have different roles within making sure that the curriculum reform is a success for Lithuania. So as I've just said, webinar 1 will focus on leadership of principals. The next webinar, webinar 3, will focus on teachers and teaching in the classroom. So we will have the first hour for everybody, all of you, all the groups, and then after the first hour, we will focus on teaching in the classroom. Number 4, webinar 4, will be very much the second half of that webinar. Will focus on the role of people working within the ministry, the national agency, and people responsible in the municipalities. And then number 5 will focus the second part of the webinar. So everybody comes to the first part for the first hour, and then the second part of that webinar will be very much focused on those people that have written the competencies and written the documentation. So we just wanted to make sure that our webinars were relevant to the different groups, rather than doing something which might be appropriate on certain points in all of the webinars. So we've got a focus on the different groups. So we want everyone to attend the first hour, and then the remaining 3 hours, I've got a focus on a specific group. And if you want to attend those, that's absolutely fine. But you need to be aware that you might be a compiler, somebody that's written documentation, but you will be attending the second half of today's webinar. It will focus on school leadership and the role of principals. So if you have any more questions about that, please put them in the chat box, because I know Jane's monitoring the chat box, and we'll be happy to answer them, because we don't want people to be confused. And then webinar 6, the final one in this section, will be for everybody, just as webinar 1 was. Okay, so the purpose of part 1 of this session for the next hour is to reflect on the OECD report, which was written about Lithuania, was written about the schools and the strengths of schools in Lithuania, but also identified some areas for development or some areas that needed to be addressed. So that's the first part. And then the second part, as I've already mentioned, looking at Croatia, Wales, and Scotland. Okay, so we asked you at the end of the webinar last week, we asked you to look at this document, which was available in Lithuanian language. So hopefully it wasn't too difficult. I've looked at it many, many times in English, obviously, and found it quite an interesting and quite an easy document to read. So the follow-up work was for us to discuss today, revisit that review of education, and hopefully now you are familiar with that document and what it says about education within your country. So I'm now going to pass to Jane and ask her to carry on saying a little bit more about this.
Thank you, Jane, and good morning, everyone. It's good to be with you all again. Jane and I have just picked out a few highlights from this document. And as Jane said, you've all had an opportunity to look at it since last week. So there may be points that you want to make later on in this webinar. But first of all, what did the OECD say about education in Lithuania? They said that learning outcomes and learning in ways that support a comprehensive, competency-orientated curriculum were improving, but needed to improve further. So the trajectory is upwards, but there is a need to continue improving. The next two bullet points are really important. Performance levels for students in Lithuanian schools are not high, and particularly at the highest levels of achievement, the number of students achieving those high levels is not as good as it needs to be. So the progress that pupils and students are making in schools needs to improve. And that's summarized by the bullet point underneath that says 15-year-olds in Lithuania are trailing behind 15-year-olds in Baltic neighbors. So compared with your neighboring countries, students are not performing as well as they need to. A shared understanding of good teaching and how to achieve it has not been established. And this point, of course, links back to student progress and student outcomes. We know from all the international research that the key driver in schools that supports student achievement is the quality of teaching. So achieving that understanding of what constitutes good teaching and then improving teaching in schools is a key point that the OECD report was making. Next slide, please, Jane. So digging down a little bit into the detail of that, what they said was there needs to be more focus on a good use of assessment data by all teachers. So collecting accurate assessment data and then using it. What we often find is lots of data is collected, but then not appropriately used to support student progress and student achievement. And included in that is a better monitoring and reporting on disadvantaged pupils. So those students and pupils who come to school who are perhaps from poorer socioeconomic backgrounds, who need different kinds of support from teachers in schools. They're making sure that they have take advantage of the same opportunities as all students in the schools. And linked to those two comments, of course, are the need for better quality assurance systems. And that would be at all levels, at school level, at municipality level, and at national level. So collecting the assessment data, so monitoring what's going on in schools, collecting information about that, but using information to identify what's going well, so you understand how to build on what's going well, but what needs to improve, so resources can be allocated to those areas. And this final bullet point refers to older secondary students and links to the technical vocational education that they receive, and making sure that there's a clear link between what's required in employment and what's going on in schools, so that students who are taking that path for their future careers are clear about those vocational opportunities. I'm just going to stop there because we've got, I don't know if this is only occurring on the English channel, but we've got some feedback. Are you hearing it as well, Chris?
Yes, I am, yeah.
It's, I don't know what the interference is, but there seems to be an echo on the translation.
I'm not hearing the echo, Jane, but you're a bit scratchy.
I don't think I'm not sure it's me.
I just want to inform we can hear echo because not everyone is mute. Because if you're not speaking, it's better to mute it because we hear reflection from other not is muting. Yeah, like
Aušra, gali išjungti Salomėjos, matau, mikrofonas įjungti. Aušra, tu gali tą padaryti. Kaip...
Okay. Do we think it's me? Okay. Well, let's continue then. Next slide, please. We had a look at this data last week. So let's just kind of remind ourselves, this is a summary of the PISA results for Lithuanian students between 2006 and 2018 by maths, science and English. And what you can see from these graphs is that there has been improvement, which is good, but you can see there that improvement is not consistent over time. It goes up and down. Next slide, please, Jane. And this is looking at that in comparison to other OECD countries. In other words, comparing Lithuania with the average across OECD countries. And if you look at the difference between Lithuania and OECD countries, you can see there's still a gap. Although there's been a slight closing of the gap in, say, for example, mathematics, it still needs to close even more. There is still a gap between the average OECD and the performance in Lithuania. Next slide, please, Jane. Okay, our first breakout session. what we'd like you to do is, given the OECD findings, how do you think the curriculum reforms will help you address the issues in the OECD? And given your role in the curriculum review process, what are your priorities? Okay, how are you organising people, Jane?
I've got 10 rooms, Jane, and I thought for the very first time, just to make sure everybody will be moved to those rooms, you and I will be able to go around and check that everything's okay. What I would like to happen is I would like when people get to the room that they unmute their microphone so we can tell that you are actually there. Otherwise, what we find is that we have a breakout room where we think there's 10 people, but actually only 2 people are engaged in the conversation. And that's a waste of time.
Maybe our groups know, maybe feedback for the lectures. So we was the 7th group. We first of all...
Mes galime pradėti 5th grupę, jeigu galima būtų.
Okay.
Ar galima būtų 5th grupėj pristatyti?
Yes.
Gerai.
Yes.
Labai dėkoju 5th grupės nariams, kurie pateikė savo nuomonę ir aš pabandysiu tiesiog pristatyti grupės nuomonę. Taigi, kokie galėtų būti arba yra šiuo metu prioritetiniai veiksmai arba kažkokie tai etapai. Tai pirmiausia, mes suskirstėm viską į tam tikrus klasterius arba grupės, tai yra ministerija, nacionalinė švietimo agentūra ir mokykla ir mokytojas. Tai va tokie 4 didžiuliai sandai. Ir jiems kaip ir priskyrėme arba galvojame, kad jų prioritetai galėtų būti tokie. Ministerijoje, aišku, bendrųjų programų patvirtinimas, ko mes visi labai laukiame. Toliau nacionalinės švietimo agentūros prioritetai galėtų būti būtent bendradarbiaujant su švietimo centrais, būtent kvalifikacijos tobulinimais, įtraukti mokytojus į mokymus, kad visoje Lietuvoje atsirastų vienodas supratimas, vienoda samprata, kas yra atnaujintas ugdymo turinys ir kaip jisai, ką su juo daryti. Toliau taip pat NŠA galėtų būti konsultacijos, atviros dienos, informaciniai renginiai, stažuotės. Šalia NŠA prisijungtų ir vadovėlių rengėjai, kurie taip pat ir pateiktų metodinės rekomendacijas ir NŠA taip pat metodinės rekomendacijas, žinome, rengia, žodžiu, tai vat tokie jų galėtų būti ir tie prioritetai. Mokyklojegi vadovo pozicijoje žiūrint, mokykloje turėtų kiekviena mokykla pasirengti ugdymo turinio atnaujinimo diegimo planą. Ar 1 metų, ar 2, ar 3, priklauso nuo savivaldybės, kokie savivaldybė yra susitarimai. Ir aišku, mokykloje. Ir tame plane turėtų būti vėlgi tam tikrų mokytojų tos pačios informacijos, ką gavo iš švietimo centrų, parnešimas tos informacijos į mokyklą, pasidalinimas, sklaida, taip pat tų pačių bendrųjų programų analizė, nagrinėjimas kartu, tai yra mokymasis vieniems su kitais ir vieni iš kitų. Na, o mokytojų lygmenį tai turėtų būti gerosios patirties pasidalinimas. Jeigu aš dalyvavau kursuose, aš parnešu tą informaciją savo kolegoms ir dalinuosi. Ir taip mes visi, va, tas korys ir atsiranda, kad sulimpame į korį tvirtą ir visi turime tą pačią informaciją, tą pačią medžiagą ir tą patį supratimą ir sampratą, kas yra ugdymo turinio atnaujinimas ir kas yra bendrosios programos atnaujintos ir kaip su jomis turėtume mes dirbti. Ačiū 5 grupiai už nuomonės sudarimą. Viskas.
Jane, you're on mute.
That's interesting, isn't it? Because you're going to be talking to colleagues later on, principals later on, about the importance of planning. So thank you very much for that. There is a, could one of the translators please, while we take the next piece of feedback verbally, could one of the translators translate the comment that's in the chat box for us? If you just write it in English, that would be fine. And then Jane, Chris and I can respond to it. Thank you. So the next person, I think, is group number 7.
Okay, so that the feedback should be for you, and maybe Lithuania will be translate. I agree with the 5th group, what they mentioned. First of all, in our group, we have made a short polo about did they expect that new exchange will help to improve our numbers. And more than half of the group said yes, they agree. And the second is like another part, about 30% of our group said that probably they have some doubts. And it's very important that we should change our systematical look in the education. Also, we need to think about the health for the teacher, like in the 5th group was mentioned. Also, we need to speak about individual learning, not like the massives, but also that we have individuals, not only the mass. Of course, it's financial issues, but it's also very important. And also what is mentioned in the 5th group, that is very important to speak about the teacher preparation, the support for the teacher, because usually we want, in some cases, we want to give the freedom for the teachers, but it's very fine the line between the freedom and what is necessary. This is, I think, the biggest question. But in general, I can say we have beliefs that it will help, but we have many questions still not answered. So that's all.
Thank you. I think perhaps we got time for one more, Jane, do you think?
Yeah, just one more. I mean, I'd love to hear what everybody has to say, but I think perhaps just one more this time, and we'll take a different group next time. So do we have any volunteers?
I'm waiting for the here comes the translation in the, there's something else in Lithuanian in the chat box. So
yeah.
I haven't got the first translation yet. So
group 2 had an interesting discussion. Perhaps they could offer some
That would
feedback.
be great, Chris. Would somebody from group 2 like to unmute themselves and
Tai aš nežinau, kodėl ta kolegija, kuri moderavo mūsų grupės darbą, neatsiliepia, bet negaišindama mūsų visų brangaus laiko, tai noriu pasakyti, kad ir pasidžiaugti, turbūt ir vėliau tos kitos grupės, kai kalbės, yra akcentuojami tie patys dalykai. Tai, ką išsakė prieš tai kalbėjusios grupės, tai irgi buvo kalba apie sisteminį požiūrį, apie pagalbą mokytojams ir apie mokymąsi. Ir buvo dar labai, norėčiau labai pasakyti, kad Nacionalinė švietimo agentūra organizavo puikius mokymus atrinktiems mokytojams dalykų, skirtingų dalykų, kurie buvo nepaprastai sužavėti iš vienos pusės, kaip jiem viską sudėliojo į stalčiukus, bet iš kitos pusės jie grįžę sakė, mūsų laukia nepaprastai daug iššūkių ir vienas didžiausių tų iššūkių yra finansai. Kaip įsigyti tų priemonių, kaip mokytojai čia išsisukti šitoj vietoj, kad tai, kas yra puikiai sugalvota, būtų įgyvendinta. Tai va tos pagalbos ne tik mokymais individualiaus, nes aš matau, kad yra daug kolegų, vadovų, kurie tai daro, nes jau mes metus laiko tam ruošiamės irgi po truputėlį ir planus šiokius tokius turėjom, dabar dar pasistiprinsim ir mokymuose dalyvaujam. Tai pagrindinis akcentas, pagrįšiu, tai yra vėlgi tas sisteminio požiūrio pasikeitimas ir jį toliau reikia čia tą daryti ir mokymasis mokytojų, pagalba mokytojai, mano galva šitoj vietoj tai tikrai reikėtų dar, jeigu būtų lėšų valstybėje, kuo daugiau mokytojų į tokius individualius tos mokymusis ir kad jie galėtų dar pagrįžę skleisti tą savo patirtį. Tai jeigu ko nepasakiau, antroji grupė papildykit. Ačiū labai.
Okay, thank you. We now have the comment translated in the box there, Jane.
Yeah. And this is about teachers who participated in qualification courses do not always transfer the information to their colleagues. And those who participate in many seminars do not absorb the materials. Well, we'll be doing some sessions later on, won't we, on professional development?
We will.
And later on this morning, we're picking up with the principals, we're picking up the whole concept of collaboration.
Yeah.
Which is obviously part of that first comment there. It does depend on the brief that the teacher has when he or she goes off to the training. If part of their brief is to come back and support other colleagues, then that's what they need to do. We've got another comment. Perhaps it could just be verbally, Egil, perhaps it could be verbally translated to us. The second comment.
I think we've had the second comment translated, Jane. It's the first comment we haven't had.
So it's Egil, it's the one from Regina.
Yeah, Regina Zuiken.
I think we're going to have to pass on that.
Okay. It's yeah, I see. I think it's just worth mentioning, Jane, that everybody, all the groups have mentioned collaboration and how important that's going to be. And we do talk about collaboration a little bit later on in our webinars, and also teacher preparation. So I think, it'd be nice to hear more from everybody, but hopefully during the morning, everybody will have had an opportunity to express their opinions on some aspect of the reform. Okay, so Jane, if you're happy, I think we'll move on.
Yes, and you're kicking off this next part, aren't you?
I am indeed. So as mentioned, we're going to talk about 3 international examples of curriculum reform: Croatia, Wales and Scotland. 2 of the countries introduced a competency framework, 1 did not. And you may wish to find out more about these initiatives in your own time, because I do think it is quite interesting to know what other countries did, the things that went well, but equally to find out about the things that didn't go so well. So the Croatian one, School for Life, or Scholar as they called it, was a project that I was heavily involved in. I spent 3 years working in Croatia, helping and supporting the curriculum reform, working with teachers initially, and then I was asked to design the roadmap for training of school leaders. The one thing that Croatia made a big mistake on was that they did not involve their school leaders, their principals, early enough. They started the reform and the principals had no part to play. And that was a big, big mistake. And it took us a long time to try and catch up. So the curriculum reform was introduced in 2015. That was when it was first introduced, and it was launched with schools in 2018. And what Croatia did was set up expert groups. First of all, it set up expert groups of mentors, and those mentors were about 125 teachers that were seconded. So they were taken out of the schools and became a group whose job it was to work in classrooms and work with teachers in different subject areas on introducing the curriculum reform. There was also a group of international consultants, of which I was one, and we had a range of roles to play, which I'll say a little bit more about in a moment. So it started in 2015, but it didn't actually go into any schools until 2018. And then 74 schools were used as pilots or experimental schools. 48 of them were primary, 26 were secondary. And those pilot or experimental schools were schools that the mentors worked with and talked with and learnt lessons from. The sadness about the Croatian reform was that it had two major events. It had a change in government, and unfortunately, the government that came into power didn't carry on in quite the same way as the original one, and the minister changed and the civil servants changed. And of course, they had the COVID pandemic, as all of us did. So it didn't finish as well as it might have done, and it's still going on. I mean, these things take a very, very long time, but I think they had hoped to be further forward now than they are. And at the moment, there's a big evaluation taking place to find out the exact position where Croatia is and what has to be done next as it picks up the reins once again. So essentially, there were school leaders that received school leadership training. And one of the big problems we had with the school leaders in Croatia was that they did not think their job was to be a leader. They felt their job was to be an administrator. And we had a real battle to convince them that the role of the school leader was to lead teaching and learning, and that teaching and learning was the core business of those school leaders. And it took some time to convince them, but a bit like a converted smoker, once they were convinced, they were absolutely leading and very, very keen to talk with their principals right across Croatia. So what happened is that I, with these school leaders, created a training roadmap, so a plan for the whole of Croatia. We trained them in school leadership, and they became very, very skilled at understanding the modern role of a school principal. And then they became accredited school leadership trainers. So we trained them in school leadership, a little bit like we've done in Lithuania. We've got 35, I think it is, exactly the same. We've done exactly the same in Lithuania, but in a different way. In Croatia, we had 20 school leaders who were accredited to be trainers, and they, with us, developed materials that could be used to be taken out to other principals. So they produced a toolkit, just as Chris, Jane and I have produced, working with Lithuanian head teachers, a toolkit for Lithuania. And Croatia made really good use of those materials. It made really good use of its principals, and it created something called principal mentors. So this group of school leaders would go and help other leaders, but also would train them. And they now, even now, are still delivering school leadership training. So we trained them to be trainers, and we worked with them on producing materials that made sense and were very much in the culture and context of Lithuania. So that took place, but it took place a little bit too late in my view. But it was a whole 2 years of work that took place before the school leaders were involved. And in my view, a reform will either be very successful or it will fail according to the quality of the principal leading the school. Because when it comes down to it, the reform takes place in the classroom with young people. Now, they made a major investment into the reform, did Croatia. They produced a virtual platform called Lumen, on which there were lots of materials for teachers to look in. All our training was filmed and put up on Lumen. They would have discussions and meetings and sharing of good practice on Lumen. And also a lot of groups made use of Teams, where there were materials put up on Teams. Again, people got together, People chatted, people had blogs going on, all sorts of things. And we trained over 100 mentors. I was part of the group that were training mentors, and we had 4 areas. Those mentors were trained in how to use learning outcomes in the classroom, because that didn't happen in Croatia. Teachers just talked and students listened, what I would call old school teaching. And so we introduced learning outcomes. So there was a group that were becoming specialized in that. Another group that was becoming specialized in teaching critical thinking and problem solving, because that was considered high priority in the Croatian reform. Another one on giving students the skills of being able to be independent learners, learning to learn. And then the one that I was involved in is I was involved in teaching mentors how to be coaches, so that when they went to speak to teachers and principals, they actually got them to find the solutions for the problems. Because with any reform, there are loads and loads of problems. And one of the issues was that teachers in Croatia didn't think for themselves. Whenever there was a problem, they immediately expected somebody else to solve it for them and to be told what to do. There was a culture of people waiting to be told what to do next. And so the idea was with the coaching, and it was a big part of it, was to encourage teachers and principals to actually think for themselves. And many of the principals introduced coaching right across their schools as a policy to change the culture, so people thought for themselves, took action for themselves, rather being waited to be told, this is how you solve this problem, this is what you do next. So what were the challenges? As I've already mentioned, Croatia, school management, school leadership was completely focused on administration tasks, not on leadership. People did not accept that their role was to lead. There certainly wasn't enough focus by the principals on leading, teaching and learning. It was almost something that happened if they had time. The other problem for Croatian head teachers is that it didn't have any deputies. All they had was something called a pedagogy, who was supposed to be responsible for teaching and learning, but actually they did all sorts of other tasks, meeting parents, dealing with children that had issues. They never got to the core purpose of the school of leading, teaching and learning. And so the structures in Croatia were not set up. And the other thing was that Croatian principals are voted in every 4 years. Not exactly the best way to get the best candidate. And if you lost the vote after 4 years, you went back to being an ordinary teacher. So there was no security of their jobs. And then another one, which I found, because I was asked to go into some of the Croatian schools, was that teachers' attitudes and expectations were that they expected a significant increase in resources. And by that, they were expecting wonderful new textbooks, lots of computers and IT facilities. They expected that there would be a massive amount of resources for them to use. And actually that didn't happen. Those kind of things take quite a long time to procure. But actually, when it boiled down to it, the best resource for the curriculum reform was the teacher. The teacher was the most important thing in the curriculum reform. They were the best resource. If they could deliver high quality teaching and learning, which encouraged students to develop various skills that had been identified or competencies, that's exactly what was needed. You didn't need fabulous new textbooks. You didn't need lots of new computers. You needed a really good teacher. And eventually the teachers came round to that, to realizing that they were the ones, they were the people that were most important. They could make this reform work. So they did have a problem with people wanting lots of resources, but it took a while, but we eventually convinced them the greatest resource was a teacher. Okay, so we have actually had some of our Croatian principals come and speak to some of the principals in Lithuania on a webinar. And they talked a little bit about the challenges. And what they were saying was that it was really important that principals and school leaders stuck together to help each other. And that social networks could be a real advantage. It absolutely could support sharing of good practice and also sharing of things that go wrong, because I'm a great believer that you learn probably more for things that don't work rather than necessarily things that do work. They suggested that you needed to be patient. You'll have a lot of teachers that are anxious and worried, that you need to be out there walking the talk, motivating people, praising people for doing things well, but also praising people for trying new things out, which may not work, and not scold them if things go wrong, but praise them for being brave enough to try something out. And be positive and be optimistic and make sure that you're involved as much as you possibly can. And then a realization that you need to distribute the leadership of the reform to other people. You can't do it on your own. It was difficult in Croatia because you didn't have that leadership structure. You didn't have middle leaders, you didn't have other senior leaders. But what the Croatians did was they found bright young staff that wanted to make their mark or were really excited by the reform. And they were happy to help, happy to play a part, happy to be part of the team that was leading the reform in the school. So the leadership of the reform was distributed out to other people. One principal on their own cannot do it. The other advice was to get to know all parts of the reform. Make sure that you're absolutely up to date. Keep an eye on the website, make sure you know of the changes, make sure you share those changes. And then to make sure you share the school's good practice with others in the school and with other schools as well. And collaboration was a really important thing, not just communication, but actually collaboration. So that was the advice to principals in Lithuania. So that's a very, very quick walkthrough of what happened in Croatia. We can always talk a little bit more about that at a future date if you would like us to. Jane.
Before we pass over to Chris, and I know we're over time already, so we're short of time. There is one question in the chat box, Jane. I don't know if you'll be able to answer it briefly. What arguments did the Croatian government use to stop the competency-based education reform?
Well, they didn't actually stop it. It was just purely a change of government. People were not accessible. It still sits there, and many of the schools have introduced competencies and have changed the way that teaching and learning takes place. It has been embraced, but it was just purely a change of government, change of administration, and I suppose not there wasn't the drive there to move the reform forward. So it hasn't been abandoned, it's just not moving at the pace that it originally was.
That's something all countries experience, isn't it? When the political colours, governments of countries change, then their priorities change, and that's not helpful sometimes to us in education. There is another question. Maybe Jane could tell us which of the mentioned actions took place in 2015 and 2020, and which after the suspension of the reform. Perhaps that's something we could pick up later, Jane, and maybe we could summarise in a PowerPoint at the beginning of next week.
Yes, I didn't quite catch the understanding of that, but you and I can talk about that.
Yes. Yeah, it's
okay.
There in the chat box in English. So
okay, I'll check.
Oecd is translating the questions as they come up, which is really helpful. So thanks.
Okay.
So Chris, it's over to Chris now.
Okay. I'm going to talk briefly about the Welsh experience, And if I put that into context, Wales, as a country of the UK, received devolved power over the school curriculum in 2001. And standards, according to the OECD PISA results, fell in Wales after the devolved powers went to Wales. And so by 2012, the Welsh people were very concerned that the education system in Wales wasn't fit for purpose and that standards were falling in Wales compared to the rest of the UK, in particular to Scotland, but also to England. And so in 2013, the Welsh government began a review of the school curriculum, and they engaged international experts to help them to design a new curriculum. And then in 2015, they decided to go ahead with the curriculum for Wales. And they, in particular, wanted to move away from a subject-based curriculum to a skills-based curriculum, to embrace, if you like, the way in which the PISA tests test skills, not knowledge. So from 2015 to 2018, the new curriculum was designed and tested in 60 schools across Wales, known as the Pioneer Schools. And if we could go to the next slide, please. So what happened then was that I've got a time scale here. And I think one of the things that is important to point out is that Wales have done things very slowly. They started thinking about this in 2012, so 10 years ago. They are only just introducing the new curriculum 10 years later, this September, and that will be for certain pupils only. And if I talk about how they have done that, they've designed the curriculum, they've tested it in schools, they've trialed it in schools, they've refined it in schools, and they did that in selected schools until 2020. And then for the last 2 years, all schools in Wales have been preparing to deliver the new curriculum. And then they will start to deliver it from September 2020. So from this next month, from tomorrow. They have concentrated very much on professional standards of teachers and of preparing young teachers and more experienced teachers to be able to deliver the new curriculum. And they've put a great deal of emphasis on professional development of teachers. At the same time, they've also looked at the way that qualifications work in Wales. And in the whole of the UK, you may well know that the examinations of children at 11, at 14, at 16 and 18 are very high stakes for both schools and children. And so they have developed the qualifications in line with the new curriculum changes, and they've changed all the curriculum, all the examinations. So if we move on to the next slide, there's been a great emphasis on professional learning and teaching standards. And as Jane has talked about in Croatia, a key point is this will only work if the teachers are good enough to teach the new curriculum. And so you have to train your teachers and support your teachers to be able to actually undertake the new curriculum. In addition to that, in Wales, what they did was to completely change the degrees for teachers joining the profession. And they redesigned teacher education degree for new teachers to embrace the concepts of the new curriculum. And they have also introduced a master's-based course across all the universities in Wales to be able to train existing experienced teachers and school leaders in the implementation of the new curriculum. And they've looked at pedagogy, so the actual craft of teaching and learning. They've looked at leadership. They've looked at professional learning. They have encouraged teachers to be innovative, to collaborate with each other, and based on a set of values that we'll talk about for a moment next, please. For the next slide. Thank you. Just to give you an indication, there is a missing decimal point on this slide that I noticed yesterday when I was looking at it. The Welsh Government put a huge amount of money and resource into professional learning of teachers and school leaders in the run-up to the introduction of the new curriculum. And so if you consider that €1 is about £1.2, so you're looking at about €17 million in 2019-20 to develop regional professional learning and local programs, and a similar amount in 2021-22 and 21-22. They've also put about £1 million into the national master's qualification, and that second one is 12 million. It should be 1.2 million, and then 2.1 million in the last year. And then direct grants to schools. So in other words, directly money going to schools to help them to deliver the professional learning. Again, huge sums have gone in over the last 3 years. They've also closed schools to pupils for 6 days a year so that teachers can prepare to deliver the new curriculum during their school year without the children being in the school, so they can work together as groups of teachers. We'll go on to the next slide, please. So what they did in Wales was they looked at what are the purposes of education, and they identified 4 purposes. They said children in Wales should be ambitious, capable learners. They should be enterprising and creative. They should be healthy and confident individuals, and they should be ethical and informed citizens. So the whole concept of the new curriculum in Wales is that you embrace those purposes in the different areas of learning, and the teachers have designed the whole of the curriculum around the 4 purposes. And so instead of it being 30% discretionary in Wales, it's 100% discretionary in Wales. There is no set content that is being mandated by government. That's up to the teachers in each of the schools. So if we move on to the next slide. There is universal support in Wales for the 4 purposes. But it's that everybody recognises it's a huge change from teachers to move from, in effect, a textbook-based, content-based national curriculum to a skills-based curriculum that's designed at school level by individual schools. And clearly, that's a huge risk for Wales. High risk and high reward, so that all individual schools are asked to design 100% of their own curriculum. And that's a major issue for the Welsh Government and for Wales. But they're very confident about it, and they're very confident about the ability of their teachers to manage these changes. And if we just move on to the next slide, I think that's it actually for Wales. And then we move on to Scotland. But just to make one last comment about the Welsh Government experience, they are concerned about how it's going to work. One of the reasons that they've been able to do the 100% curriculum design is they have a structure of middle leaders in their schools where different teachers take responsibility for different areas of the curriculum. And so they can delegate and responsibility, school leaders can delegate responsibility much more effectively because people are actually paid to take responsibility for aspects of the curriculum. And I'll hand over back to James to look at Scotland.
Thanks, Chris. There is a question in the chat box, but I think we'll wait till we get the translated version from Egil, because time is pushing anyway. Let's move on to our third example, colleagues, which is from Scotland. And in Scotland, they've developed what they've called a curriculum for excellence. And this idea started in 2004, but it wasn't introduced to schools until 2010. So picking up on the comments that Chris made about that long lead-in time, you had a similar thing in Scotland, where there was 6 years where the education department, local authorities and schools were exploring this concept of the curriculum for excellence. What it provides is a coherent entitlement curriculum for students between the ages of 3 and 18. And it was introduced in 2010, and it's already been updated. It was updated in 2018. Up to the age of 15, all students study a broad general education. So it's what we would call in English a compulsory core curriculum. And from the ages of 15 to 18, there's opportunities to study for qualifications, awards, vocational training, and so forth, so that students develop the appropriate skills and knowledge they need for higher education, work, and life in general. One of the things they've emphasized, which is similar to our Croatian and Welsh examples, and similar to the curriculum reform in Lithuania, is this emphasis on skills and attributes so that young people can adapt, think critically, and actually flourish and grow in today's world, which, as we know, is constantly changing. Similar to Wales, what they did in Scotland was they had parallel reforms. And this is actually, I think, a critical point. So whilst they were reforming the curriculum, they also looked at other aspects of education that would have an impact on the delivery of that curriculum. So people coming into the profession, new teachers, there was a whole new training program for them so that they were ready for those reforms. They started up a national parent forum, because one of the key things they did in Scotland was really emphasize the importance of collaboration across the wider educational stakeholder group, and that included parents. They opened a leadership college, and this is similar to Wales. And the leadership college was for leaders at all levels in the school. They introduced a new qualification for head teachers, and that was complemented with a new set of leadership standards. Next slide, please. So the curriculum for excellence really focuses on 4 fundamental capacities. And it's trying to emphasize the lifelong nature of education. And this is clearly a message that as teachers, we want to get across to everybody that we work with. You never stop learning. It doesn't matter what job you're in, how old you are, you're always learning. So what they wanted was confident individuals who were successful learners who could effectively contribute to their local and national community and to the global community, so that they would, all young people would become responsible citizens. That was key to their thinking. So the 4 capabilities recognize the need for all students to know themselves and to develop relationships with others, both within their families and beyond into the community. Have the knowledge, skills, attributes that they need to thrive in an interconnected, digital and rapidly changing world. And be able to contribute as a democratic citizen to shape the future of our world. Next slide, please, Jane. I think this is quite an important slide, because one of the kind of underpinning principles to the Scottish Reform was that the educational curriculum, the school curriculum, isn't just about what goes on in the classroom. It's about what goes on outside the classroom as well. And those things have an impact on student learning. So you've got at the bottom left, you've got the curriculum areas and subjects for the classroom. And across on the right, you've got interdisciplinary learning, how subjects can work together, how maths and science might work together, how English and history might work together for the benefit of students. But in the top 2 boxes, you've got an emphasis on opportunities for personal development. And those could be inside the school, but could also be activities that the school is organising for young people to participate in within their own communities, such as through work experience. And finally, you've got the ethos and life of the school as a community. There's such a huge amount that children and young people learn from the way in which the school operates, the values and principles that underpin the day-to-day workings of the school, how teachers work with each other, treat each other, work with students, treat students. That hidden curriculum, if you like, is a place where students learn a huge amount. Next slide, please, Jane. So the broad curriculum, 3 to 15-year-olds, no surprises here, really. It's very, very similar to Wales. The difference is, though, that what you've got in Scotland is defined curriculum documents that schools work from. There's an opportunity to personalise those to their particular context, but there is a broad curriculum, agreed curriculum for each of these subject areas. And you'll notice the comment at the bottom. The curriculum is available both in English and Gaelic. Again, similar to Wales, where the Welsh curriculum is available both in English and Welsh. Very important to Scottish and English colleagues that Welsh and Gaelic translations are available in their schools. Next slide, please, Jane. So this was some quick advice, really, from Education Scotland, which is the name for the Scottish Ministry of Education. So going to that centre point of the slide, in developing the curriculum, in curriculum making, what school leaders and teachers need to think about, first of all, at the top, is understand the learners. Absolutely critical. Understand the children and young people that you're working with. Know about the big ideas that you're developing, but also be clear on practical approaches. You know, how to translate those big ideas into meaningful learning opportunities for students in classrooms. On the bottom right, know about your own learning needs and how to support those needs. So again, same as in Wales, a big emphasis on professional development. Teachers and school principals being key to this whole reform. And finally, over to the left, develop your networks outside of your school, learning networks beyond your own school, so that you can share and learn from other education professionals. Next slide, please, Jane. Interestingly, the OECD did a review of how the curriculum is going in Scotland in 2021. So we've got some up-to-date feedback, if you like, on the strengths and areas that still need, for Scottish people still need to look at. But this was their summary comment. Scotland's curriculum for excellence offers an inspiring and widely supported philosophy of education. Its framework allows for effective curricular practices and for the possibility of a truly fulfilling education for learners. Building upon its commitment to education quality, Scotland can make adjustments within the curriculum for excellence framework, flexible framework, to achieve its potential for learners present and future. Well, I think all of us would be pleased to receive feedback like that. Inspiring and widely supported. Curriculum change doesn't happen unless you've got that wide support from the educational community. But that final comment about the flexibility of the framework is also very important, because as you learn more about how the framework is being implemented and you learn about its strengths and perhaps its weaknesses, it's really important to be able to make adjustments to make further improvements. And the final slide from me, Jane. Sorry, penultimate slide. So from the OECD, students from challenging socioeconomic backgrounds are more resilient. That's really important in Scotland, because you have quite significant communities that are struggling in terms of their economic backgrounds. So that is an important statement. Scottish schools are inclusive. Again, a really good piece of feedback. So it doesn't matter what background you're from in Scotland, schools welcome you, and it doesn't matter what your abilities are, schools welcome you. There is a general upward trend in attainment, global awareness, and employment destinations. Fantastic. Students show positive attitudes and connections to schools. And that's what we want, isn't it? When young people turn up at school, we want them to be positive and we want them to be there. Risk behaviour is declining. So amongst young people, smoking is declining, drinking alcohol, and disruptive behaviour. And this is very important in all our communities, but is particularly important in Scotland, where there's been lots of challenges around young people's smoking and drinking and drug-taking habits. So challenges for the future: updating the vision, reviewing the curriculum for 15 to 18-year-olds, and that is obviously clearly related to the changing nature of our work patterns, and maths attainment is declining. And that's something that all jurisdictions really need to keep their eye on. How are their students doing in maths, English and science, the core elements, if you like, of a curriculum. And now finally, Jane. So what has helped the implementation? So what lessons can we learn from the curriculum for excellence? First of all, it was introduced by consensus, and the government created this management board with a range of stakeholders on it. Education Scotland, the ministry, provides guidance, resources, and quality assurance. So it's there in the background with those overarching structures to make sure that things can work on the ground. The curriculum for excellence was implemented through local authorities and head teachers. So local implementation with the support of heads. And when I was working with head teachers in Scotland in 2014, 2015, they were very much behind this curriculum initiative and spent a lot of time talking to me about it and how thrilled they were with its implementation. System alignment and coherence has now been established. So the structure, if you like, the whole structure underpinning it is working well. Now there needs to be more focus on making sure that teaching is improved, so learning outcomes continue to improve. And one of the ways you can do that is through research programs and evaluating the data that you've got. So those were the OECD's final comments.
So okay. We have a question in the chat box here.
Right.
And it's from Antanas, same person that had the question about Croatia. Could Scotland's 4 fundamental capacities be translated and understood as 4 competencies? They go on to say, in the context of Jane Doughty's slides, there is no difference from our definition of competencies.
I think that the 4 fundamental capacities are in a sense similar, but not quite the same. When you look at the detail of the Scottish curriculum, and there wasn't time to go into that today, you'll see more reference to the competencies that you are using in Lithuania. So, for example, there is in their curriculum documentation, there is a clear emphasis on digital awareness, digital skills. So I think that I would say that these 4 fundamental capacities are at a kind of higher level, and then underneath that are the competencies.
Great. Okay, I think that answers the question very well, Jane. Thank you very, very much. Okay, so we were going to go into breakout rooms, but I'm thinking we're probably a bit short on time, Jane. Or do you think we should give that chance and we'll amend the other presentation?
Jane, I don't think we can. We're 35 minutes over time, so I think we have to ask people to take away their reflections, and perhaps we can start webinar 3 with getting some feedback.
Yeah, and actually I think that's probably quite a good thing. So we won't go into breakout rooms, but what we'd like you to do is to think about those 3 presentations that Jane, Chris and I have given. Mine a little bit more from the principal's role, Jane and Chris's far more about the content of those curriculums and lessons learnt, and perhaps come back next time ready to talk to us about what you think you might take away as a lesson for Lithuania. Now, what we have got, Jane, is we've got the references here. The British Council booklet is available, and I know that our Lithuanian team could email that out to everybody. It's only short, it is in English, but if you wanted to use Google Translate to do so, it's only 4 or 5 pages. And then there's plenty of information online about Scotland and also about Wales. So there may be one of those countries that you've particularly been interested in, and therefore we would urge you to look at it in a little bit more detail. Okay, so Joan, we were going to go on to have a short break. We were going to give them 15 minutes. Shall we reduce that to 10?
We can do. I mean, people can have a cup of coffee in 10 minutes, can't they?
Okay, so it's 9:38. So I tell you what, shall we say we'll be back here for 10 to 10.
20.
Okay.
Jane, should we ask the principals to unmute themselves and just say their names and which school they're from? Is there time to do that?
I think so. I think it would be nice to get to know people, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
And could our translator please translate this other message from Antanas? It's in the chat box. That's fine. If you can just type it in the chat box, Jane and I can continue here with asking people to
Yeah, fine. That's okay. Thank you. Whoever gave us that comment, thank you very much indeed. Should we move on, Jane?
Yes. So we've got, these are our principals. So who've put their screens on. So would anybody like to just introduce themselves?
Just very quickly.
Sveiki, aš esu Daina Rožnienė, Kauno taikomosios dailės mokyklos direktorė.
Sveiki, esu Tomas Jankūnas iš Vilniaus Antakalnio progimnazijos.
Kauno Simono Daukanto progimnazija.
Ne čia, tik ten.
Okay. Vida, would you like to introduce yourself?
Labą dieną, su Vida Lesauskienė iš Trakų rajono Lentvario Šimelionio gimnazijos.
Labą dieną, mano vardas Darius, pavardė Šaras, esu iš Kauno taikomosios dailės mokyklos direktoriaus pavaduotojas ugdymui.
Thank you.
Sveiki, Žaneta Vaške.
Zaneta?
Vilniaus Žvėryno gimnazijos direktorė.
Okay.
Vilniaus Žvėryno gimnazija, Jolita Kančiauskienė, direktoriaus pavaduotoja ugdymui.
Vitalija Kurpeikienė, Šilutės Pamario progimnazija, direktoriaus pavaduotoja ugdymui.
Žičkevičienė, Kauno rajono Nelės Augustino Trauzų pradinės mokyklos, direktoriaus pavaduotoja ugdymui.
Šarūnas Gerlaitis iš Verkių mokyklos.
Okay. Have we had Natalia?
Labą dieną, Natalija Dzivitaeva, Klaipėdos progimnazija, Gedminų progimnazija.
Sound's gone off.
Okay. We aren't hearing anything at the moment. Is anybody speaking to us? Okay.
I can speak, but maybe they are on the other channel. We know it's common channel, then it's a channel for English language and for Lithuanian language. And maybe some issues because you must hear translation.
Okay, I'm hearing the translation now, but I didn't get the first part of the message.
Okay, but here now we're on the how to common channel with both languages.
Okay, okay.
I think we need to make a start, Jane, because we're running an hour behind.
Yep, okie doke. Really nice to welcome everybody. And let's now start with the purpose of webinar 2. And Jane, I think I'm starting off with this one. So what we want to do is to look at the impact of high quality leadership and how important it is, and how important it will be for Lithuania, for absolutely bringing up the standards of pupil outcomes, student outcomes in Lithuania. And we're going to look a little bit at the role of the principal in preparing for the reform, because you are key people, absolutely key. You will be the people that will make it happen, or the people where it will be a problem if your leadership is not of a really high quality. We're going to give you a very brief introduction to distributive leadership, or distributed leadership, collaboration and coaching. We could spend a whole webinar on each one of those, but we're just going to do an introduction. We're going to talk a little bit about curriculum mapping and classroom auditing. Again, you could in fact spend a whole webinar or several webinars on those areas. And then just to touch on how important it is to create an action plan, a simple action plan that is shared with everyone. Okay, so distributed leadership, collaboration and coaching. So what we've got here is something that's come from a document that actually Chris, who was with us a little bit earlier, was part author of, and it's down to some work that they did in Nepal. And essentially what this is saying is that the best school leaders are rounded individuals who can be effective in all aspects of leadership. Someone who can be very clear in setting the strategic direction. And you absolutely must have a direction of travel, know what you're doing and where you're going with this reform. Very, very important that you are a good leader and that you know your strengths and your weaknesses as a leader, that you're able to engage other people and build and sustain relationships with other people. You will need a team. You cannot just have one or two people working on the reform. You need a team of people from a range of different areas, so that you've got opinions and views of perhaps the newest teacher right the way through to one of the most experienced. And I think it's all very important. Such leaders often have really good plans and they get the team together, but actually it's their job to really drive forward the plan and to deliver it, to get things done, to check up on it and make sure that things are going in the right direction. So a school leader has got to be somebody that has lots of skills and lots of energy. So let's just have a little bit of a look at some of what the successful leaders actually do. And this is from some research with Barbara Whelan and Clark. And I think it's very important that we focus on student achievement ahead of personal interests, personal ideas that you've got. The core purpose of a school is teaching and learning and getting the best out of young people. Therefore, a successful leader in a school, whether it's the principal or the deputy principal, they will have that at the forefront of their mind. They also need to be resilient. So when things go wrong, they don't give up or they don't become depressed. And I think, resilience has become quite an important area. And further down the line with these webinars, we will be talking about resilience. That the leader is resilient and bounces back. That they are persistent, that even when things go wrong, they keep on having that energy to keep going, but they can also be adaptable and do things slightly different. They have an understanding of people, so they know the strengths and weaknesses of the people that they are working with, and they're very clear about the context in which they're working. They understand the context of their school. They're able to take a risk, and if it works, then they praise everybody. If it doesn't work, then they learn from having taken a risk that perhaps hasn't worked. They challenge people's beliefs and people's behaviours. And I think within the curriculum reform, it's really quite important that beliefs are challenged and that we change from the old style of doing things into a different way of teaching and learning. And the good leader is self-aware and willing to learn, willing to try new things. But above all, they've got to be optimistic and enthusiastic. We then got a couple of quotes here from McKinsey in 2010 and the OECD. School head teachers in high-performing systems devote 8% of time to improving teaching and learning. One of the things Jane and I often do is when we're working with head teachers is that we actually get them to look at how they spend their time. And they're often shocked that the amount of time they spend on teaching and learning is very little in comparison to what else they do. The OECD, their research says that if leaders are undertaking instructional leadership actions, in other words, working on teaching and learning, if you can see that that is happening in a school, it's a strong predictor that the school will have good performance. So leaders that aren't working on instructional leadership, they tend not to have schools that are high performing. So it's very, very relevant indeed. So if we're talking about leading the reform in your school, you absolutely must have a focus on teaching and learning, because that's what the reform is all about. It's about changing how teaching and learning takes place in the classroom. Knowledge is still very important, but it's how that knowledge is taught. And I found in Croatia that often teachers seem to think that competencies had to be taught separately from, say, the history curriculum. And that's absolutely wrong. And it's one of the misunderstandings. We teach history, but we teach it in a way that children and students can develop competencies. We need to make sure that that leadership of the curriculum reform is distributed amongst other people so that we've got people on board. If they're part of the leadership team leading the reform, they're going to be far more engaged and take far more responsibility. So don't be afraid of giving leadership to a really junior member of staff. Maybe they're really skilled in ICT or digital literacy. Get them on board, get them working with you. Use the people that are able to help and support you. Don't worry about hierarchy. Worry about whether they've got the skills to be able to help or the skills that you can develop. Now, many reforms have had problems with no middle leaders, no heads of history, heads of English, heads of math. So you've got to get round that in some way, and perhaps by inviting somebody who is a strong teacher, someone who's an experienced teacher, maybe to help and support you in the introduction of the reform. Now, I think one of the things that the Croatian teachers really appreciated was the training that was provided, and they particularly liked the training that was provided by their colleagues who had been given the expertise to help and support them, because they felt they knew what it was like to be trying to do this back in the classroom. So they had empathy. But also with school leaders, we need to make sure that our school leaders are very clear about how important they are in this reform and how important teaching and learning is. It may be something that you think, actually, I wouldn't mind introducing coaching into my school. Many schools, particularly in the United Kingdom, now have a policy where everybody has a coach to help them improve their teaching and learning. And certainly in Croatia, the principals and the teachers felt that coaching was a really very good part of the curriculum reform, giving them the skills of being able to be a coach to another colleague. Communication is all important. Again, Croatia had problems that they didn't communicate well with the press, and the press and the media picked up bad stories where parents weren't happy about something. So communication is all important with all the stakeholders, parents, members of the local community. And if you've got a success story, share it with the press. Nothing better. Auditing current practice in school, you may find that there is more content and more skills and competencies being delivered in your school than you perhaps already knew. So it's worth auditing what's happening and saving that, keeping that, rather than starting with a blank sheet of paper. Forming the team to take the reform forward, we cannot emphasize that enough. It's absolutely important that you spend time developing that team, making them feel important. And your role is to lead that team, to praise them, to support them, to help them, to give them the confidence to try out new things. And then creating a plan of action. Very, very important that there is a plan and that everybody shares in that plan. It's not something that the head teacher keeps to themselves, but everybody has a copy of it, and that it's simple and that you can tick off and celebrate when certain things have been achieved. And then, of course, there's the collaboration within school, teachers working with each other. And we'll talk a little bit about the difference between collaboration and communication, because people often think that by talking to somebody, you're collaborating. That's not the case. Collaboration in school is important, but it's also important across schools. If you've got a school down the road that has teachers that you could work with, you could share training, you could share good practice, and actually you could share the opportunity of teachers feeling that they're part of a team. You could even create a team with another school or another couple of schools where maybe all the geography teachers get together and actually start to be an implementation team, and they share everything with all the schools. So it can be very rewarding and very exciting, although at the start of reforms, I think people find it quite challenging and quite frightening and quite worrying. Okay, so distributed leadership or shared leadership, what is it? Now, many of the principals that came to Cardiff a few months ago, I think met Alma Harris in terms, she is a researcher and spent quite a lot of time looking at school leadership. And these are her definitions. It's about shared, collective and extended leadership, which builds capacity. And because, you know, the day job doesn't go away, this reform is an addition, then what you must be doing is building capacity in your school that enables you to make that change and makes that improvement. And then she goes on to say that, as I've already just mentioned, that it's about mobilizing leadership experience at all levels. Don't be hierarchical. Choose young, bright, enthusiastic people that can help you, and they will add huge capacity that will help you bring about this improvement. Because actually, what is the reform about? We've seen the OECD documents, it's about improvement. And then genuine distributed leadership requires high levels of trust. You must trust the people you're giving the responsibility to, and they need to trust you that if they get it wrong, that you will treat them appropriately and support them. So trust is very, very important. It needs to be transparent so people know what they're doing, and it's based on mutual respect. I can remember as a principal having huge respect for some of my young staff because their vibrancy and their skills in the classroom were just a joy to watch working with our students. So this is what distributed leadership is all about. It's about helping you build capacity. And it also gives teachers who may be in the future aspiring to become leaders the opportunity to practice that leadership, to practice it at different scale of leadership. So they haven't got too much, but they've got some responsibility, different time and different ways. It also helps to build harmonious relationships, perhaps between conflicting groups. I can remember bringing into a group or into a team people who I knew were against me. I knew weren't going to be supportive, but the idea was that by being part of that group, we talk them round. It's suitable for working with competent employees. In that group, in that leadership team, you want some people that are very competent, but there isn't any harm in bringing somebody in that you think they've got potential. Let's bring them on board and help and support them. And as I've already mentioned, it gives aspiring leaders an opportunity to gain some leadership experience, and so that they can go on and be possibly the principals of the future. And most countries are struggling to get people to take on the role of principal. So any opportunity to gain some good leadership experience can only be helpful to individual countries. It uses the knowledge and experience that people have that may not necessarily currently hold a leadership role. I think it's particularly relevant in terms of digital literacy or digital content. Many of our young teachers do have skills that many of our older teachers don't have and are not interested in. And I think one of the key things about distributing leadership to others is that they feel part of the team, they share in the responsibility, they share in the successes, and by getting them to be part of the team, even the person who is doubting and probably not very supportive, if you can get them into the team and get them enjoying the team experience, then it will really help to form a team that enjoy the success and being part of that team, which is leading the reform forward in your school. Okay, so if we go on to professional collaboration, and I've already mentioned that collaboration and cooperation or communication sometimes gets confused. Collaboration is absolutely the cornerstone of distributed leadership, but it must have purpose and it must be disciplined. Often people put together working groups thinking that they're now collaborating. And that might be a team of people, it might be a professional learning community, but all too often, all they're doing is cooperating with each other. They are not collaborating. Cooperation then is just a bit of a loose social connection where people chat and discuss things. Collaboration is very much about achieving a common goal. And if the reform is going to be successful, your distributed leadership in your team of people that are going to help you, there must be collaboration. They're working together towards a goal. And it's not easy, actually. People often don't understand the skills of collaboration. So it needs to be repeated and practiced. People need to understand that there's a shared goal and that they will have to take some responsibility. They can't just be a passenger and turn up and engage in conversation. And as Alma Harris here says, cooperation is really more about loose social connections, and it's a very weak basis for improvement, probably better than nothing, but it's certainly not as good as having quality collaboration. So the differences between high-performing and low-performing schools can often be looked at and attributed to the amount of leadership distribution. The principal that doesn't trust any of their staff often is working in isolation and the reform isn't going well. Whereas a principal that brings on people into a team, distributes it amongst other people, doesn't worry about hierarchy, but actually gets the right people to join, those schools are usually much higher performing. And here we have another quote from Letwood, is high-performing schools widely and wisely distribute leadership. It's about trusting other people, and it's about appreciating that as the leader, I don't know everything and I can't do everything. Okay, so let's just move on here. And Jane, I think you're going to be moving to collaboration within schools and with other schools.
Yes, before we do so, Jane, colleagues have been writing their names and schools in the chat box, principals and deputy principals. And I put a message in there asking everybody to do it because I thought you would be able to use that as a basis for creating the breakout rooms, the breakout groups.
Yeah.
Rather than putting everybody into a breakout group. Does that work?
How many do you think we've got, Joan?
About my last count was 15.
Okay, so I can name the breakout room and ask them to choose it.
Yeah, that would be good. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
That would be the other way of doing it, wouldn't it? Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
We've got a record there of our principles, which is good. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for doing that, colleagues. It's just helpful to Jane and I with so many muted and no cameras on the screen. It's difficult for us to work out who's who. Oh, actually, it's impossible. Anyway, collaboration within school and with other schools. So just picking up on the comments that Jane has been making and elaborating on those a little bit. As Jane said, collaboration and distributed leadership are linked. They're inextricably linked. Because clearly, if you are distributing leadership within your own school, then what follows from that is that you will want to work collaboratively with those colleagues to whom you have given those leadership responsibilities. And you actually can't have effective distributed leadership without collaboration. Because otherwise it feels to the person that you've distributed leadership to that you're just kind of passing something on and just leaving them to get on with it. And remember that Jane said that one of the key advantages of distributing leadership is that it allows people to take up leadership responsibilities for the first time. And those people need to work collaboratively, and they need your support as an experienced leader for them to learn how to do leadership. And the research clearly shows that one of the things that aspiring leaders want is to be given leadership responsibilities so they can practice and develop their own leadership skills. So what we can have is teachers collaborating within subjects within their own schools. And we can have teachers collaborating with teachers in other schools. So clearly the first example, so in school collaboration is much easier to organize. And I guess happens anyway, because teachers are natural collaborators. They want to share, they want to work with colleagues. They want to learn from other people. So that collaboration, I guess, goes on all the time in your schools. Organizing collaboration across schools is a little more challenging. That has to be organized. And in my experience, the best place to start with that is with like subjects. So maths teachers in your school collaborating with maths teachers in other schools, because already they've got common ground on which they can work. Principals collaborating with each other. That is so important. And the culture in this country has, amongst school leaders for many years now, has been a collaborative one. And one of the things that we've fought hard with, if you like, there's two things, collaboration and competition, because schools are also in competition with each other for pupils, for students. But in most cases, that need for competition has been overridden by the strong professional drive to want to collaborate with other principals. And then you can have, of course, collaboration at local authority, at municipal level. And we get that in this country where we have academy trusts collaborating with another academy trust. So that's kind of an example of local and regional collaboration. Because in this country, in England, local authorities don't play such a significant part in education as they did, say, 20 years ago. Next slide, please, Jane. So here's just a couple of examples, really, to illustrate the difference between collaboration and cooperation. So collaboration implies shared ownership and interest in specific outcomes. And that is absolutely critical. So you're clear about what you want to achieve from this collaborative enterprise, and you have vested interest with your other partners in achieving those outcomes. So let's work together on a shared teaching and learning policy for use in both our schools. So working together to produce an outcome that can then be used by both your schools. Cooperation, on the other hand, could just mean you've given me help with something that I'm working on. And cooperation's important, but it isn't collaboration, as Jane has said. So an example would be, please look at my teaching and learning policy and tell me what you think. Give me some feedback so I can develop it further. So two distinct ways of working there. Both have their place, but it's really important to be clear about when one is being used and when the other is being used. Thanks, Jane. Jane mentioned coaching, and she spoke about the fact that this is being used increasingly in schools, certainly in England and in Wales and in Scotland. It's being used at all levels, headship level and right through the school. So it's used by principals and mentors in the Croatian reform. And as Jane has said, that's been a very, very valuable part of that reform. But it does require an investment of time. It's not a quick fix. It is a slow developmental process. And to be an effective coach requires significant training. And it can be used both to support improvement in teaching and learning. So teachers can coach each other. So an external coach could coach teachers inside a school. Coaching is usually done on a one-to-one basis, but I have seen it work effectively in small group situations. It's usually done face-to-face, but I have also seen it work effectively over the telephone and remotely. So if you're thinking about this as a way of working, think creatively about how you can use this strategy in your own school. And it can help change the culture because it does give staff more autonomy. What coaching is doing is giving them responsibility for identifying what they need to develop, how they need to develop, and how they're going to do it. Next slide, please, Jane. Now, you may be very familiar with Goleman's 6 leadership styles. And if you are familiar with that research, what you'll know is that coaching is one of those styles. And what does it do as a leadership style? So what we're saying here is, as a leader, you can use coaching in your day-to-day work to support the people that you work with. It helps staff identify their strengths. It encourages staff to have long-term development goals. It provides ongoing support and feedback. And it encourages staff to identify their own solutions. When I was in headship, every single day, staff would come to me with a problem that they wanted me to solve for them. They wanted answers from me. And I used to say in staff meetings, I'm not the head of answers. The answers lie with all of you as well. So it's important when you're a principal, when somebody comes to ask you a question and you make a judgment about their ability to deal with that issue, that problem themselves, put it back to them. What would you do about that? How would you research some possible solutions to that? Okay, go away and do that research and then come back to me with your suggestions about what possible solutions could be. It gives those staff more autonomy, more ownership over the work that they're doing. And as the bottom of this slide says, staff move away from waiting for the principal to tell them the solution. Next slide, please, Jane. When Jane and I are doing coaching webinars, and we have done these quite frequently, and we've done it face-to-face with colleagues as well, the coaching model that we use is the GROW model from John Whitmore. And here's just 3 quotes from him that we thought you might find useful. Coaching is a process that empowers other people. It gives the coachee an opportunity to drive their own development, to think about their own solutions. Coaching is designed to reveal another person's capabilities and thus improve his or her performance. If I'm being coached and my coach is asking me to think about how I might approach something, then what I'm doing is stretching my intellectual thought processes about possible solutions, so I can improve the way I do things in the future. Coaching is an aid to learning for yourself. It helps us become autonomous, independent learners. And as educationalists, that's what we want for students as well. We want them to be independent learners. So you could consider introducing a coaching program to support the introduction of the reform in your schools. And if you are interested in that, Jane earlier mentioned the toolkit that we developed with Lithuanian colleagues. And there is one of those modules in that toolkit is focused on coaching. And I'm sure in that module you'll find lots of resources that would be useful to you in school. So I think it's breakout now, isn't it, Jane? Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to ask you to join a breakout room now. And you'll be with your colleague principals and deputy principals. And what we'd like you to look at is how might you use one or more of the following: distributed leadership, collaboration, and/or coaching to help you implement the Lithuanian curriculum reform. So how much time, Jane, do you think? 15 minutes?
Sorry, I'm on mute. What I've done is I've created 2 principals and directors, okay? and one for deputy principals and other senior leaders. Not because I want people to be separate, but just so that there's hopefully, listening to what people said, that will split them into 2 groups of around 7 or 8 people. Okay.
So we're confident we've got enough deputy principals to make that a viable group?
If we don't, I can move people around, no problem. Yeah. But what's also important, Jane, is that the people who need sign language all go into the same room with the sign person, right, the person that's signing for them. So there's 2 rooms set up, and you have to choose which room you go into. And I've just roughly split it. I just thought we'd get a bit more opportunity for discussion, right, if people could
And which room are you putting the colleague that's doing the signing in?
I would suggest they go into the deputy principal one. Okay. So if you're signing, if you're doing sign language, go into room 2, and it's labelled deputy principal. Even if you're a principal, there is no stigma at all. It was just purely an organisation thing. I could have said everybody that's wearing red or everybody that's wearing blue. All right, just so that we've got 2 different rooms and the smaller numbers, and you get the chance to have a good chat.
Better discussion, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's now our time, 10:30, so 12:30 in Lithuania. So should we say 15 minutes?
Yeah.
Because after this breakout, we then have... Okay. I haven't got my phone with me, Jane, so is it worth taking a photo of all these people? You're muted. Jane?
In the principals group?
No.
Oh no. No, sorry. I've just been to the principals group, and there's only 2 people engaged in conversation.
Oh. Is that because they're not unmuted, or is that because they haven't got anything to say?
I don't know. I mean, they must be there, Jane, because they chose to go.
Yeah.
Right, I've taken 2 screen prints of the people.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we need to, it's time to bring them back now.
Yep. Principals, and we had the deputy principals and other school leaders. So we had room 1, room 2. I am able, as Jane is able, to go into those rooms. So I came to see what was happening. Obviously, I didn't understand what you were saying, because quite rightly, you're speaking in Lithuanian, which is what we want you to do. But I did notice in room 1, it was mainly Thomas and Jan Kunis who were having the discussion. It didn't look to me like too many other people were getting involved. I don't know whether there was a problem there. Room 2, however, there was some good discussion going on, Jane, amongst the deputy principals and senior leaders. So let's start with room 2. And I wondered if Christina or Audron, I'm hoping I'm saying that word correctly, could give us some feedback on what they felt about using distributed leadership, collaboration, or coaching. Would it be useful? So if you'd like to unmute yourselves and talk to us, that would be great.
In Lithuanian, please.
No, I can't hear anything. So Christina or Audron, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that word.
Christina is muted.
Garsą įsijunkit, Kristina.
Okay, right. Unmute yourself, Christina, and talk. Please speak in Lithuanian, please.
Lietuviškai šnekam? Gerai. Mes kalbėjome, kad be abejo, kad pokytis įvyks ir pradėjome nuo to, kad bendradarbiavimas ir coachingas apima ir pasidalintą lyderystę. Ir be šių dalykų šiandieninė organizacija kaip tokia nepriklausomai kuriam koncentre yra, ar tai pradinė, pagrindinė. Girdisi, ar ne? Girdisi. Tikrai keliauja tuo keliu. Mums svarbiausias dalykas yra, kaip vienas mūsų grupės narys kalbėjo, kad mūsų visos grupės, kurios veikia mokykloje, metodinės grupės, aktyviai tame dalyvautų. Ir dabar pastebėjom, kad apie jas nebuvo minėta prieš tai paskaitoje, kai kalbėjome, skirta, bet šie dalykai yra labai svarbus. Ir pabaigoje kalbėjau ir nacionalinės agentūros atstovė patvirtino tokį dalyką, kad mums reikalingi žingsniai, kad mes sėkmę pasiektume greičiau, tai nusimatyti žingsnius ir bendrus visai Lietuvai, bendrus pagal mūsų turimus koncentrą, kaip ir minėjau, pradinės, progimnazijos, gimnazijos, reiškia pagrindinės mokyklos, netgi iki mokyklinės ugdymas, kad mes žinotume, kad vadovas pirmiausia tą informaciją turėtų ir galėtų perduoti savo administracijai, metodiniam grupėm, pavaduotojai taip pat galėtų tą informaciją perduoti ir mes turėtume tarsi ėjimą keliu, nuo ko mes pradedame ir per kiek laiko mes tuo keliu nueisime. Žmonės laukia tikslumo, dėl to, kad šiuo metu mes visi kūrėme šių programų įgyvendinimo veiksmų planą, kaip tai vyks. Ir tai yra labai svarbu, kad mes turėtume vieną matymą, tai turėtų būti ir tam tikri ir iš nacionalinės agentūros, manau, nurodymai, kad būtų lengviau tuo keliu keliauti. Nes dabar mes visi suprantame šiek tiek skirtingai, nors ir einame į tos pačius seminarus ir diskutuojame, ir jau daug esame padarę, ir savo mokykloje jau tuos žingsnius planuojamės, tačiau manau, kad tai reikalinga tokie unifikuoti žingsniai, kad visi žinotų, per kiek laiko mes bandysime eiti. Aišku, planas yra tas dalykas, kas turi kintamumą ir keičiasi, tam jis yra planas, kurį mes galime keisti gyvoje aplinkoje. Tai aš paminėjau patirtį, kai buvo įtraukiojo ugdymo ir mokyklos turinčios europinę patirtį, kalba apie tai, kad tai yra 10 metų kelias. Tai gal ne 10, viskas dabar keičiasi ir spartėja, tačiau tas kelias turi būti pakankamai įgyvendinamas mokytojui, nes kalbam ne tik apie sąvokas, kalbam ir vertinimo sistemą, kalbame apie daug dalykų. Ačiū Jums. Prašau papildyti kolegas.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think, Jane, what I picked up there was that those areas of distributed leadership, collaboration and coaching haven't been mentioned before in other trainings. Did you pick that up? Or?
Yes, I did. I thought I also heard the importance of all stakeholders within the educational community working together effectively, which of course we would agree with.
Yeah. Okay, can we go to room 1, which was the principals, and either Thomas or Jan Kunis, please could you give some feedback on the discussion? I was a little bit anxious that when I was just listening, there seemed to only be 2 people having a conversation.
Jūs be reikalo, Jane, nerimavot, nes diskusijos jie virė. Mes tiesiog labai mandagiai vieni kitų išklausėme nepertraukdami. Tai ir Tomas taip pat turėjo laiką pasisakyti. Tai nuo vadovų grupės Žanetos paprašėme pristatyti tai, ką mes aptarėm. Ačiū.
Okay, fine.
Žaneta, mikrofonas.
Sveiki, tai mūsų grupė stengiasi keliais aspektais aptarti tos klausimus. Aišku, pasidalytojų lyderystė labai svarbi kiekvienoje institucijoje ir kiekvienas iš vadovų patikinome, kad reikia pasitikėti savo mokytojais, reikia pasitikėti kolegomis, bet skatiname ir nepamiršti tų gražiųjų patirčių, kas jau yra padaryta nacionaliniu lygiu, savivaldybių lygiu. pasižiūrėti ne tik į savo mokyklą, bet dažnai galioja ta taisyklė, kad savam krašte pranašų nebus ir labai sveika bendradarbiauti su kitų regionų mokyklomis. Tai pastebėjome ir pasidalinome tokia patirtimi, nes mūsų grupėje buvo žmonės iš Kauno, iš Vilniaus ir iš kitų Lietuvos miestų, kad skirtingose regionuose yra labai skirtingos patirtis. Tai mes tikrai žinom, kad pavyzdžiui Kaunas jau pernai turėjo pasirengę ugdymo turinio atnaujinimo diegimo planus ir šiais metais jau turės stebėseną. Vilniuje dar šito yra prašoma. Taigi mes turim tokią labai gražią erdvę dalintis vieni su kitais ir kviesti vieni kitus, kad kartu vieni kitiems kalbėtume apie ugdymo turinio atnaujinimą, planavimą, procedūras, kaip ir prieš tai grupė minėjo apie tai, kad apie kelią ir tame kelyje mes esam tikrai skirtingose stotelėse. Tai noriu pastebėti, kad teko vadovauti veiklos tyrimui ir stebėti, kaip 30 Lietuvos mokyklų ruošiasi rengtis tam turinio diegimui, kaip mokytojai kartu sėdėjo kūrybinėse dirbtuvėse, čiupinėjo kompetencijas. Kiekvieną skirtingą kompetenciją pasirinkęs, bet pasilyginę kaip viena ar kita to paties dalyko mokytojai dirba, tai mokėsi vieni iš kitų. Turėjome kitas kūrybinės dirbtuvės, mokėmės planuoti pamoką, trečios kūrybinės dirbtuvės organizavome pamoką ir visą tai darėme, kaip jūs čia minėjote, kaučingą, tai yra, buvo pakviesti mokslininkai ir čia mūsų tarpe yra Aušra Kazlauskienė, kuri tikrai labai gražiai altruistiniais pagrindais stebėjo mokytojų darbą, koregavo tas veiklas. Tai aš siūlyčiau truputį neužsidaryti savo mokykloje, bet paaugti ir bendradarbiauti vieni su kitais ir taip kartu eiti, siekti to tikslo. Kiti galite papildyti, nes tikrai buvo kalbančių daugiau.
Labai teisingai pasakei viską beveik, tik tais šiek tiek kalbėjau, kad ir lengvai, kadangi tikrai yra mokytojų didžiuliai krūviai ir nėra labai daug galimybių, tiek, kad tu galėtum visas mokyklas aplankyti ar nuveikti į svečius ir panašiai, nes tiesiog darbo grafikai yra tikrai labai įtempti, ypač didmiesčiuose, nes krūviai didžiuliai mokytojai, tai nėra paprasta padėtis. Bet mano mintis buvo, kad yra dalykų, kaip pavyzdžiui, lietuvių kalbos, užsienio kalbos mokytojų yra daug, turiu minti anglų 5 ir 4 mokykloje, tai jau jie turi kaip pasikalbėti ir kaip mato tą turinį, nes mokykloje irgi labai svarbu vienodas matymas ir taikymas susitarimai, nes mokytojai keičia klases, mokytojai vaduoja vieni kitus ir tas aiškumas leidžia lengviau pertikti ugdymo turinį. Nėra taip, kad kiekvienas dirba taip, kaip nori ir ką nori. Bet yra dalykų, kaip pavyzdžiui chemija, fizika, kur yra po vieną mokytoją ir jau jiems tikrai to išėjimo į išorę yra labai gerai. Ir aišku, aš siaurinčiau, man kaip mokyklos vadovai labai svarbu ta geroji praktika, idėjų pasisėmimas, ką dar kitaip galim pamatyti, tai labai fainas. Tai tokių kūrybinių dirbtuvių tikrai irgi būtų smagu turėti ir čia galėtume galvoti apie tinkliukus, bet tas turbūt irgi labai patogu. Labai būtų smagu ir Kauną nuvažiuoti ir visą kitą, bet vėlgi prasideda esminiai, kada, tai tik yra mokinių atostogos, kada mes tą galim sau leisti laiko ir prasideda krūva klausimų iš kokių lėšų. Tai daug paprasčiau, kai yra netoli, greta ir panašiai. Tai supratau, kad galiu skambinti Žanetai ir sakyti, kad kartu pasinagrinėkim kažką veikti. Žaneta pakankamai arti manęs, bet aišku, būtų kartais smagiau ir dar labiau, bet riboti, labai riboti ištekliais, nes tiesiog, kai mokytojai dirba dideliais krūviais ir pavargsta ir tų dienų nori turėti ir dar turi galvoti apie ateitį. Tai ateičiai kaip laiko taip pat reikia skirti ir tai reikia rimtai atsižvelgti. Aš baigiau, atsiprašau.
Thank you. Great. Thank you very much.
Okay, so clearly some very good discussion. And it's good to hear that everybody is looking towards collaboration, as I think that will be a very, very important aspect of the success of your reform, to be working together and to be collaborating, not just cooperating, not just communicating, but actually collaborating. So it's good to hear that. I've just put something in the chat box asking you to switch back to the Lithuanian channel, because when Thomas was speaking, I think he might have been on the normal channel, so we were struggling a bit to hear the English translation. When you go to a breakout and come back to the main room, your translation drops out, so you have to re-select Lithuanian, otherwise you're on the main channel. Okay, right, so I think what we'll do now, Jane, it's 11:05. We were planning another very short break, so we'll come back, I think, at 11:20, 11:20 or 11:25. What do you think?
I think 11. Given the times running out on us, I think we'll have to cut the 30-minute break to 15 minutes. Sorry, colleague. Okay. I'm sorry. Okay. But, don't you, Jane?
Yeah, absolutely. So 11:25.
Yeah.
Which is 1:25 your time. So if you could cut.
Yeah, 1:25. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll see you at 1:25 for the final session.
Yeah. Thanks, colleagues.
Okay.
Right. Okay. That you do. So could we have the next slide, please, Jane? And this is starting with what we call an audit, a classroom audit. So the purpose of this really is to be absolutely clear about what you're currently doing, what your strengths are, what your areas for development are, and what the content of your curriculum is. Because you need to audit that in order to know what changes you need to make. So as it says here, auditing the quality of teaching and learning as well is a key part of that. Identifying good practice and areas that need improvement. Sometimes we focus too much on the areas that need improvement. It's important to do that, but it's also important to recognize the areas of good and best practice. First of all, to celebrate those areas, but secondly, to build on them. What's happening in that practice that makes it good, that makes it excellent? And how can you as a school build on that? Jane mentioned earlier that working as a team and sharing tasks is really important. This is a big job, colleagues. So having that team and sharing those auditing tasks across the team is critical. And use the knowledge to bring people into the implementation team. So draw on your strengths as an organisation and decide who is best placed to be in that team. But don't necessarily choose the obvious people. Look beyond who you might normally choose. Because it's important that that knowledge is then used to create the plan. Next slide, please, Jane.
Sorry.
So as we've said already, this curriculum mapping, mapping out what you do in the curriculum, what you do and how it's done, the big job, but necessary for this reform. It'll take time and it's hard work. It's not necessarily an easy task. So it requires, as we've said, a team of people. And that team, of course, will need highly effective leadership. It can be the principal. It doesn't necessarily need to be, but it needs to be somebody who holds a senior leadership role within the school. somebody who's in the senior leadership team. And doing a thorough and effective job at this stage pays dividends later on. If you invest time and effort and energy into this process, it will be very, very useful to you later on as you introduce and embed the reforms. Next slide, please, Jane. What is this saying? It's saying, and this is from an organisation in England called the Education and Endowment Foundation. And the EEF does a lot of school-based research, trying to work out what actually is effective in school. And their definition of effective goes back to the point that we've been emphasising since we started to work together. And this is about student outcomes, improving outcomes for students. It doesn't matter how great an educational idea or intervention is in principle. What really matters is how it manifests itself in the day-to-day work of people in schools. So you need teams of people in your school to translate those ideas into highly effective practice. Investing time and effort to carefully reflect on and plan and prepare for implementation will reap rewards later. So that's reinforcing what we've been saying in the earlier slides. Next slide, please, Jane. So what's the purpose of this curriculum mapping? If you're going to spend a lot of time and effort on it, you need to be clear about, why are we doing this? It identifies the current subject content and existing competencies that you may already have in your curriculum. So it's taking a picture, if you like, of where you are at the moment. So that picture it gives you of what's being delivered to students in the school is really important. And it doesn't tell you just what is being taught, but it tells you how it's being taught. So getting a good picture of how that curriculum is being delivered. The teaching and the learning. But importantly, and remember what we were saying earlier about the OECD report into the education system in Lithuania, it helps you also look at what's being assessed. So identifying in your mapping how student achievement, student progress is being assessed is really critical. And it helps you identify the quality of student outcomes in all areas. So what's the difference in outcomes between different subjects across your schools or different areas of learning across your school? So that curriculum mapping gives you a what you're doing, how you're doing it, and what impact, what difference is that making to students. So from that, you'll be able to see what's going well and what's not going so well. What are you currently doing that is reflected in the curriculum reforms that you're introducing, and where are the gaps? Next slide, please, Jane. So when you've got all that information, and as I said, it helps you identify the gaps and which reform requires delivery of subject content and competencies. So it tells you where you've got to do the most work in introducing some of those competencies and maybe some of the subjects that are being updated. helps you identify the different teaching and learning styles. What you're interested in is finding out what's really working in terms of teaching, which teachers are highly effective and are in their classrooms, students are making the most progress and therefore are getting better outcomes. And identifying the areas that need improvement in student outcomes. And all this, of course, is valuable information, can be used to help you inform your decisions about the 30% optional curriculum. It will help you decide how you're going to use that really valuable to what is really a third of the curriculum. Okay, Jane. And this is a roadmap taken from a publication in England, Times Educational Supplement. And you probably can't see it very clearly, colleagues. It is a little bit blurred, so apologies for that. But what it does is it tracks the curriculum as students go from early years of nursery, starting at the bottom. So EYFS is early years foundation stage. So it tracks what they're doing from that stage, which is where they start at school in England, through to year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, 5, and 6. And at the end of year 6, that's the end of primary education in England. So at a glance, and a very high level, of course, very high level, teachers can see what is actually happening in each of those years, so they can build on the previous year's experiences. And now it's over to you, Jane.
Okay, thank you, Jane. Okay, I think also what's worth mentioning about that roadmap, it's very, very simple, and it was only looking at content. It wasn't looking at competencies. So what's got to change in light of the curriculum reform? Well, there's new content. We all know there's going to be new knowledge, new content, and some of it needs to come out. And what I found is that teachers are quite reluctant to get rid of the old content that they're comfortable with delivering. So we've got to make sure that they are happy to get rid of the old and bring in some of the new, because you can't do everything. Otherwise, it's not done properly. Clearly, the competencies are probably new. I suspect some schools are delivering those competencies almost unknowingly. That's why, as the audit Jane's just spoken about, is so important. So we need to be sure what we're delivering and what we need to introduce. So we don't want to be doing things and then discovering that they aren't relevant. We need to be sure that everybody understands that teaching and learning styles will change. You may find that you've got some young teachers who are very, very proactive in child-centered learning. But I suspect Lithuania is very much like the UK, where we have some old-style teachers who deliver the same lesson using the same notes that they have for the last 15 or 20 years. That is no longer acceptable. Teaching and learning has got to involve the style in which the young people develop the competencies whilst they're learning the knowledge and the content. And there is a massive misunderstanding regarding the relationship between knowledge and content and competencies. Spent a lot of time in Croatia having to talk through with teachers that they didn't have to have separate lessons on competencies.
Wow. Priklijuvo, va taip su... O kaip čia suklijuvo? O turit klijų?
Atsiprašau.
Okay, I've got a conversation going on somewhere. If somebody could mute their... Okay, thank you. So there's a massive misunderstanding regarding relationship between content and competencies. You may find some of your teachers are already delivering those competencies, but there does not need to be separate competency lessons. a teacher might have a whole lesson looking at group work. So the geography teacher might actually set a geography task, but the main aim of that class, that lesson will be, we now learn how to work with each other, how to speak, how to listen, how to recap what people have said, how to ask questions. You might do that, but you would not have a separate group work lesson. You would incorporate it in the topics in the subject areas. Collaboration in school, so geography teachers working with geography teachers, not working in isolation, is important. And we've explained the difference between collaboration and cooperation. It's also important across schools. Some of the schools that have introduced the curriculum reform really well have set up collaboration. And that collaboration sometimes works face-to-face, they get together, or sometimes they just meet online and actually work on maybe a unit of work. It may be that a school is saying, we've got difficulty with this competency, and therefore let's work together on producing some lessons on digital content. So collaboration across schools will help to reduce the workload. And then, of course, assessment. That's going to change as well. You can't easily assess group work, for instance, by a 2-hour exam, because group work is not something where you can answer questions, or at least not many questions. So assessment of whether children have achieved those competencies is going to have to be different. And eventually the exam system is going to have to adjust to enable students to demonstrate their competencies rather than answer 10 exam questions on competencies. So classroom activity will change in the light of the reform. So what about checking up and updating our teaching and learning systems? Schools should have a teaching and learning policy, which everybody understands and which people have contributed to. Again, there's no point in a principal suddenly arriving saying, here you are, here is a teaching and learning policy that I have produced. It needs to be that that teaching and learning policy has been consulted on within the teaching staff. Induction process for new staff, that's going to have to change, because obviously you're teaching a different curriculum, and it may be that you need to be doing something on teaching and learning styles, which perhaps you haven't done before. May be helpful for people to have a template for lesson planning with guidance, so people are helped and supported in planning a lesson which will include competencies along with the knowledge and content. And then if we're going to share good practice, then observation will be taking place, and it will be one of the ways that principals will look at the quality of what's happening in their school. That lesson observation template is going to have to change, because you're looking for different things. You're not looking for what you've been looking at to be a good lesson in the last 2 or 3 years. It's going to be a different way of teaching. And then marking and feedback policy. That too needs to be looked at, because marking will be different. How are you going to mark a young person who perhaps has given a really good presentation, a verbal presentation? How are you going to give feedback to that young person? And what's happening certainly in many countries is instant feedback is becoming far more helpful to students, rather than collecting in books and giving them back a week later. Because, you know, the immediacy of the feedback, students can act on it. And then systems for looking at pupil data regularly. Many countries across the world only look at pupil data at the end of the year. And we have a saying in the UK, well, you're shutting the stable door once the horse has bolted. Students will have left for their summer holidays. You can't do anything about it. In my school, and almost certainly I think in Jane's school, data was looked at least every 6 weeks. And where there were issues, we would identify those pupils and put some support in place. So we need to be checking. And often what happens with the reform is that pupil outcomes go down. whilst they get used to the new way of working, but it will soon come back up again. It will soon come back up, and you've just got to be strong and accept that that will happen, because students will be taking more responsibility for their learning, and they will be far better learners if they develop these competencies. And what about a shared program of observing lessons and learning walks, actually going around and having a look at what's happening, maybe spotting something that's really good, and then at your next staff meeting, praising that person, or even asking them to give a little 5-minute, 10-minute talk about what they've been doing. But walking the talk and going around and having a look at what's happening is crucial in the reform. And it may feel like, oh, I'm not getting on with the paperwork of being a principal, but actually you're doing something far better than that. You're getting a feel for what's going on in your school. And then asking children. And you can ask children in a range of ways. You can ask them to complete a survey, and then you can meet a focus group of children. And I used to do that quite often. And I know Jane did as well when she was principal. Asking children, they're so honest, and you learn so much from them. And actually, it's a lovely way to interact with them. So asking children, I think, is really good. Jane, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just to add, Jane, it's the toolkit really to remind colleagues that there is also one of the modules in the toolkit is about supporting teaching and learning in order to improve outcomes. So colleagues might like to look at that. Yeah, the toolkit is really useful. It's got a, it's got a module on coaching, which we've just spoken about. It's got a module on leadership, and it's got a a module on teaching and learning, and it's been produced by Lithuanian principals working with us. So it would be well worth being used as a training program. Okay, now what do children tell us? And I think we don't pay enough attention to this. And they tell us that teachers talk too much. And I absolutely agree with them. Good grief. I've been into lessons where I've wanted to go to sleep because the teacher goes on and on and on. Children want to be active quickly. You know, they might be an introduction to a lesson, but then let's get them doing. They also tell us that teachers talk at them. They don't talk with them. They're constantly saying, do this, do that, do the other, as opposed to, what do you think about that piece of work? Is it your best piece of work? What could you do to improve? And pupils want teachers to check that they understand, not that they just carry on and go to the end of the lesson, because that lesson is what they've delivered for the last 20 years. Just as we today are adjusting what we're doing, as a teacher, you'd do that in a class. Children like variety of activities. They don't like to do the same thing over and over. They like to do things differently in different ways, and it makes learning exciting. They enjoy being challenged. They don't want to be asked questions that they know the answer to. They want to be filled with enthusiasm to find things out and to be challenged and to think. They enjoy it. Some children feel that they get missed out. We used to call them the grey children. They were neither very clever or they were not the ones that struggled. They were the ones in the middle that just got on and day in, day out, did exactly as you asked, but nobody really paid them any attention. So we must be mindful of that and involve them all the time. Children tell us that they want work at the right level for them. They don't want easy work. And those that are struggling don't want work that's too difficult, that it just puts them off learning. So children are telling us that not always do they get work at the right level for them. And they like teachers who give praise. And by that, they mean praise that's worthwhile. Teachers that are constantly saying, well done, well done, well done, when somebody picks up a pencil or when somebody shuts the door. Children are smart. They know that that is not proper praise. They like praise when somebody comes and says, you had real difficulties with that last week. You've mastered it today. Very well done. And off they go. And if you're in a school like mine, sometimes it's only the teachers that give them praise. When they get home, life is difficult. So giving praise is really important.
And it's also important as a principal that you model that. Well done, fantastic, walk past your class this morning. Your children were so hardworking. I was so impressed. So you model that giving of praise. And then the final thing that children tell us is that the best teachers actually like children. And that does seem a very odd sentence, but I can tell you, I had some teachers who did not like children. And one or two of them, I asked, what are you doing being a teacher if you don't like children? And sadly, the answer was, because it earns me money. And that is just shocking. If you don't like children, then you shouldn't be teaching, I don't think. There are very few people, I think, that don't particularly like children that are good teachers, because you're just not nice to them. And actually, there's no harm in being nice to a child. You know, they deserve it. And they do lovely things for us as well, you know, amuse us, entertain us, and give us a real buzz, because there's nothing nicer than coming to the end of a lesson and feeling that your children have got it and they've had a good lesson and they've learned something and they've moved forward. Absolutely fantastic.
And children know exactly which teachers don't like children, don't they?
Absolutely, don't they? Well, absolutely. Okay, next slide. So here is just a sort of 9 things in a checklist. And I think what we need to do is just identify the ones in purple there. Constant focus on teaching and learning is important. Do you in your school, across all teachers, have a shared understanding of high quality learning across the school? That is important. If everybody doesn't know what good learning looks like, you've got a problem. Do teachers know what is expected of them in terms of planning lessons? You know, some teachers think they don't have to plan a lesson because in this notebook here, what have I got? But I've actually got the lesson that I've delivered, and I've delivered it for the last 20 years. That's not right, because each class has different children with different needs. So you can't possibly just churn out the same old lesson. Do you have classroom expectations that are understood by children, staff and parents? Does everybody know what expected? Children turn up on time. Children look after their books. Children don't put graffiti on their books. That children's work is marked properly. Parents, we want them to take an interest. So are they all those expectations understood by everybody? Have we told them? Because so often we assume that people know what we want, but we've never actually told them. And most importantly, is there a shared understanding of what a good lesson looks like? And that is really, really important. Okay, I think somebody's got their video or their telephone running. Stop now, that's good. So although there are 9 things there, the ones in purple are the ones that I think are absolutely the most important. Okay, so now what do we do with that information? I think it's really important that we give good feedback to teachers on what we found when we've been walking around. And if there are things that are not working well, then we need to provide training. And people always assume that training has to be bought in from somewhere else. Training doesn't have to. You probably find that there are some good teachers within your school that could provide training to others. And that training doesn't have to be a lecture. That training can be, go and watch Mr. So-and-so teach his maths class, because he's so good the way that he works with young people. So training, you know, in the broadest sense, and sharing good practice across the school, in my view, can never do enough of it. You've never got time to do enough of it, but I think it's really great to let your teachers have some time to go and watch somebody else. And if somebody's struggling, another teacher to go along and help. And what I often used to do is if a teacher had a difficulty with a class, I'd get them to go and watch somebody else teaching that class, or occasionally I've taught that class myself and asked them to come and watch. So I think it's really important that sharing of practice across the school is so useful. And then give appropriate praise often. We can't praise often enough. I would always praise people in an open environment. If I was not happy with what somebody did, I would do that in private. So I would never, ever tell somebody what they were doing was not right in front of other people, and certainly never anywhere near children. So we need to use that information to formulate our curriculum reform plan. So there's certain things we need to be looking at, which are just the basics, really. Okay, so I think Jane, we're coming up to the last two slides here, and then we'll end. So we've just got 5 minutes left. So I would advise all of you, and you may already have done this, is to formulate your plan. But if you've got your plan, keep it under review so that you adjust it as you need to. Keep it simple, ensure it's based on the evidence that you've collected, and make sure that it's shared with the school community. And by that, I mean teachers, and I mean support staff. And in some cases, people will share it with pupils. There will be aspects of your plan that might be useful for students to know. And certainly you need to be sharing what you're doing with parents. A couple of my colleagues in Croatia, Croatian principals, had a real problem with parents who didn't understand the curriculum reform. And all they saw was that their children were not being taught the same way that they had been taught, and that they were worried about what was going to happen when it came to exams and so forth. And there was an awful lot of problems with things put up on Facebook, and it got really quite unpleasant. So it's important that your school community knows what you're doing and why you're doing. So make sure that your plan is visible, refer to it often. Don't have something that's, you know, sheets and sheets of paper, because nobody ever looks at it. It needs to be simple, and it needs to have a valuation strategy built in at the outset. How do we know we've achieved what we set out to do? Because if we don't have an evaluation strategy, there will be all sorts of subjective comments. Yes, we've done this. Well, show me the evidence that you've done it, and show me the impact. And people can't do that. So it's really sensible to have some kind of evaluation, so you will know whether you've achieved it and how well you have achieved it. And then finally, implementing the plan. Often not enough attention given to the implementation. People are very good at writing the plans, but actually then it all falls a bit flat, and there's not enough attention given to getting the drive to get it done. New ideas often added on as a task on top of the day's work. You've actually got to be careful that some things are removed to enable people the time and energy to actually take on these new activities. Often they are last minute. There hasn't been enough planning. Oh, we need a plan. Somebody's coming in to look at it, and it's not been shared, and it's not been well thought out. And I often used to find I'd make a plan, and actually 2 or 3 days I'd revisit it, and I'd have a better idea of how we might do things. So don't be afraid to revisit it. Don't try to do everything at once. Choose some things that you think you will be able to achieve, some quick wins, as we say, but don't try to do absolutely everything once. And make sure that things that you do you do well. And you not only do well, but then you can prove that you've done them well. And then a really important thing, look at what you can stop doing to create time for you as the principal, but also for your teachers as well. That is really, really important. And then communication, sharing the ideas, sharing the plan with other people, not just within school, but other stakeholders as well outside the school. I often found that people would not communicate with support staff. And for me, my support staff were as important as my teachers. And I'd often go to them for help and support. The data manager, not a teacher, but my goodness me, he used to be able to give me all sorts of information just like that, and be really supportive. So make sure they feel part of it. And then where you've got issues, training for staff, provide that training. And if you're collaborating with another school, there might be a maths teacher down the road that's got some really good lessons that they are delivering, send your staff down the road to have a look. Really important that training for staff is in the broadest terms, but if you don't train them, they aren't going to be able to step up and really make this curriculum reform something very special for your school and for the children within your school. So Jane, it's 12 o'clock and I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I think you covered that really well, Jane. So thank you. I always used to say to staff in relation to plans, it's the planning and the implementation that's critical. The written plan is simply a record of what we've agreed to do. Because often people think when they've written it all down, that's it. But it's actually the planning and the implementation, isn't it, that's critical.
Indeed. Okay, so I think we're done for today. It's been a pleasure to work with you once again, and we will see you next week. I think it's next Friday, isn't it?